Hey everybody, welcome to another deep dive with us. Today we're going to be talking about something pretty difficult I think a lot of people have experienced, and that's the feeling of being deserted by loved ones. And we're going to look through a sermon called Deserted by Loved Ones from the Temple's Table series.
Yeah, sounds like a good one.
Yeah, it looks like it'll be a good one. We're going to be exploring how faith can offer comfort in these situations.
Yeah, and I think that's a really, really important aspect of this topic because, when we feel deserted by those that we love and those that we trust, it can be a really difficult and painful experience.
Right.
And faith can be a really powerful source of strength and comfort during those times.
Yeah, absolutely. And right away, the sermon hits us with this message that I think will probably resonate with a lot of you listening, and that's that even when friends abandon us, God never will. And it uses this verse from Psalms to emphasize this. It says, those who know your name trust in you. For you, Lord, have never forsaken those who seek you. And what strikes me right away is this idea of knowing God's name. It's not just knowing about God, sort of having head knowledge.
Right.
But it's about having that personal relationship where you can call upon him.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction to make, right? It's not just about knowing who God is intellectually.
Right.
But it's about having a relationship with him, a personal relationship with him. And that relationship is built on trust, it's built on faith, and it's built on knowing that he's always there for us.
Right, and that he has our best interests at heart.
Exactly.
So the sermon goes on to quote Psalms 94.14.
Okay.
He says, for the Lord will not reject his people. He will never forsake his inheritance.
I mean, that's such a powerful verse because it speaks to God's unwavering commitment to his people.
Right.
It's saying that no matter what we do, no matter how far we stray from him, he'll never abandon us.
Right, and it really does, juxtapose that with the unpredictable nature of human relationships.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the things that the sermon is trying to highlight is that human relationships can be fickle, they can be unreliable, but God's love is constant. It's always there.
Right, it's a constant.
It's a sure thing.
So it's like offering us this lifeline,
Yeah.
reminding us that even when we're at our lowest point, there's this love that won't abandon us.
Absolutely. And I think that's such a powerful message of hope for anyone who's feeling deserted or alone.
Yeah, so the sermon builds on this idea, and it uses I think it's a pretty powerful analogy.
Okay.
It describes God as a refuge, a safe haven we can run to, when we feel abandoned.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought this imagery from Psalms 27.10 was very moving. Though my father and mother forsake me, the Lord will receive me.
That's a really powerful image, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think it speaks to the depth of God's love for us, that even when we're rejected by our own family, he's still there to welcome us with open arms.
Yeah, and it acknowledges, the pain of parental rejection.
Right.
Which I think is a really tough thing to experience.
Absolutely. It can be one of the most painful experiences a person can go through.
Right.
But it also reminds us that even in those moments of deep pain and rejection,
Right.
God is there to offer us love and acceptance.
Right. It's like an alternative. It's
Yeah.
like, okay, well, even when we're rejected by the people who we expect to love us unconditionally, there's this other source of love that is always there.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to emphasize because sometimes we can feel like we're not worthy of love or that we're unlovable.
Right.
But God's love is unconditional. It's not based on our worthiness or our performance. It's simply based on who he is.
Right. And I think that can be hard to wrap our minds around as humans because we're so used to, love being conditional. Exactly.
We're used to having to earn love or prove ourselves worthy of love.
Right.
But God's love is different. It's freely given.
Right.
And it's available to everyone.
So, thinking about those times where I have felt let down by people, people that I trusted, it really is comforting to think about the idea of God as a refuge.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's why so many people find comfort in their faith
Right.
because it offers that sense of security and stability that we often lack in our human relationships.
Right.
Knowing that no matter what happens in our lives, no matter who lets us down, God will always be there for us.
That's a really nice way to put it. And the sermon kind of reinforces this by reminding us that God's not just a refuge, but a constant presence in our lives.
Yes, and I think that's a really important distinction because a refuge is a place we go to when we're in trouble,
Right.
but God's presence is with us always,
All the time.
whether we're aware of it or not.
Right. And it points to Matthew 28.20, where Jesus promises to be with his followers to the very end of the age.
I love that verse because it speaks to the enduring nature of God's presence. It's not something that's fleeting or temporary.
Right.
It's something that's with us always.
It's eternal.
Exactly.
You know what I noticed in this section is how it transitioned from this idea of God as a refuge to something even more profound. I feel like the tone shifts a little bit.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I think it's a really important shift because it's moving from God as a source of comfort in our pain
Right.
to God as a source of joy and pleasure in us.
Right. It does. It really does. And the sermon quotes Isaiah 62.4 to illustrate this.
Okay.
It says, no longer will they call you deserted or name your land desolate, but you will be called Hephzibah and your land Beulah, for the Lord delights in you and your land shall be married. This is such powerful imagery.
It is. It really is. And I think it's important to remember the historical context of this passage.
Okay.
You know, this was written during a time when the Israelites were returning from exile,
Right.
and they were feeling deeply dispirited and abandoned.
Right.
So this promise that they would no longer be called deserted or desolate would have held immense significance for them.
Right. It was very timely.
It was, and it's a message of hope, restoration, and transformation through God's love.
Yeah. It's almost like God is saying, even when you feel most unlovable, I see you. I see your worth, and I delight in you, and I have a plan for your life.
Absolutely. And I think that's a message that we all need to hear sometimes, especially when we're feeling down on ourselves or like we're not good enough.
Right, when we're feeling that lack.
Yeah, God's love is there to remind us of our inherent worth and value.
And the sermon really drives that point home. It quoted 2 Corinthians 4.9. It says, persecuted but not abandoned, struck down but not destroyed.
Yeah, that's a good one.
What a declaration, right?
It is.
Of resilience.
Resilience, yeah.
In the face of hardship.
Exactly. We may go through tough times, but God's love never leaves us.
Never leaves us.
And I think that's something that's really important to hold on to, especially when we're going through those difficult seasons in our lives.
Yeah. And then the sermon offers, I thought, a really practical reassurance. It quotes 1 Peter 5.7. It says, cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you.
I mean, how good is that?
So good, right?
Like, how much do we need to hear that on a daily basis?
Seriously. It's just an invitation to hand over our burdens to someone who really understands.
Yes, and I think that's what's so powerful about prayer.
Right.
Is that it's an opportunity to connect with God and to share our burdens with him, to let him know what's on our hearts.
And to know that he cares, right?
Yes, and to know that he cares and that he's listening and that he wants to help us.
Right. And I feel like by sharing our anxieties with God, we're also acknowledging his presence in our lives.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point,
Right.
It's not just about asking God for things.
Right.
It's about spending time with him and allowing him to minister to our hearts.
That's a good way to put it.
And I think that can be a really powerful antidote to the feeling of isolation that we often experience when we're feeling deserted.
Right. So we're moving out of just acknowledging that God exists,
right,
into a more dynamic relationship.
Yes.
Where we're interacting with him.
Exactly. And I think that's what the sermon is encouraging us to do, is to move beyond a passive faith and into a more active faith.
Okay, so now the sermon moves into this section called Temple Summary. And this is where it gets really interesting then. I think it focuses on this powerful message. Being alone doesn't have to mean being lonely. God's love is sufficient to fill that void.
Oh man, that is just so good. And I think it's something that a lot of people struggle with, is that difference between being alone and being lonely.
Right.
We can be surrounded by people and still feel incredibly lonely.
Right.
But the sermon is suggesting that God's love has the power to transcend that loneliness. It's not just about filling a void.
Right.
It's about experiencing a deep and fulfilling connection with the divine.
And it's about recognizing that even in our loneliness, we're not truly alone.
Exactly, because God is always with us.
Right.
He's always there to offer us comfort and companionship.
And that brings us to the practical steps the sermon offers.
Right.
And it seems to focus on actively seeking God's presence in our lives.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to emphasize, because it's not enough to just believe in God.
Right.
We have to actively seek him out.
Right. We have to put in the effort.
We do. We have to put in the effort to cultivate a relationship with him.
Okay, so what are some of those practical steps?
Well, one of the things that the sermon suggests is turning to God in prayer and seeking his guidance, as described in Psalm 25.6.
Yeah. It also encourages us to wait on him, as in Psalm 25.21, which I think speaks to the importance of patience and trust.
Absolutely, because sometimes we want God to answer our prayers immediately.
Right.
But his timing is not always our timing.
Right.
And so we need to learn to wait on him, to trust that he knows what's best for us and that he'll answer our prayers in his perfect timing.
Right. And I think that can be really hard sometimes, especially when we're feeling desperate.
It can
for
be. It
solutions.
can be very difficult, but it's in those moments that we need to remember that God is in control
Right,
and that he has a plan for our lives,
right,
even if we can't see it at the moment.
right. So just trusting in him and his goodness.
Exactly.
So another one of the suggestions is to continue to do good even when feeling isolated.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to emphasize because it's easy to withdraw from the world when we're feeling hurt and alone.
Right,
But the sermon is reminding us that we're called to live out our faith even in those difficult times.
right.
And that means continuing to do good, to love our neighbors, and to serve others.
So finding strength and purpose in serving God and others even when we're feeling our most alone.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's something that can really help us to overcome those feelings of isolation and loneliness.
And then it also stresses the importance of prayer in times of loneliness,
Yes, prayer is essential.
especially as emphasized in Luke 5.16.
And I think sometimes we think of prayer as just asking God for things,
Right.
but it's so much more than that.
Yeah, it's more about the relationship.
It's about the relationship. It's about connecting with God on a deeper level.
Right,
It's about expressing our anxieties and desires.
right. Just being in his presence.
Exactly. And I think that's especially important when we're feeling deserted and alone because it reminds us that we're not truly alone.
Right.
God is with us.
He is always there.
He's always there and he wants to hear from us.
Right. And I think that's such a comforting thought,
It is.
that no matter what we're going through, no matter how alone, we feel God is always there for us.
Always.
He's always listening and he always cares.
And I think that's what makes faith so powerful,
Yeah.
is that it gives us hope even in the darkest of times.
Hope and a sense of purpose.
Yeah, because we know that we're not going through this alone.
Right.
God is with us every step of the way.
And then the sermon dives back into this theme of, never being truly alone and uses Job 7.9 for reassurance. Will you never look away from me or let me alone, even for an instant? Like, wow.
Yeah, that's a really powerful verse.
Yeah.
Because it speaks to God's constant watchfulness over our lives.
Right.
He's always there. He's always watching over us.
He never sleeps or slumbers.
Exactly. And I think that can be a really comforting thought, especially when we're feeling vulnerable or afraid.
Right.
Knowing that God is always there to protect us,
Wait.
to guide us, and to love us.
To love us, and then to kind of solidify that point, the sermon references Jeremiah 15.77. I never sat in the company of revelers, never made merry with them. I sat alone because your hand was on me and you had filled me with indignation. And this verse I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, it is. It's a very interesting verse. And I think it speaks to the idea that even in our isolation,
Right.
there's a divine purpose at work in our lives.
Yeah.
God's hand is upon us, guiding us, shaping us, and leading us toward a greater plan.
Right, even when we don't realize it, right?
Exactly, even when we don't realize it.
So even when we feel abandoned and alone, we're still part of this greater plan,
Absolutely.
guided by a loving hand.
And I think that's a really beautiful and comforting thought.
It is. It really is. And this has been such a rich exploration of this first part of the sermon.
It really has.
It's given us so much to think about,
A lot to think about, yeah.
regarding God's love,
Yeah.
his constant presence, and the practical ways we can, deal with these feelings of being deserted.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to emphasize that this message isn't just for those who identify as Christian.
Right.
The themes of love, support, and finding strength in something greater than ourselves are universal.
Absolutely.
And I think that's what makes this sermon so powerful,
Yeah.
is that it speaks to the human experience in a way that transcends religious boundaries.
That's a really great point. And that brings us to a really thought-provoking point that the sermon raises in its closing remarks.
And it's interesting how the sermon brings up this idea of God being closer than a brother.
Yeah, definitely. I thought that was a really cool point, too.
Like it uses Proverbs 18.24
Okay.
to say, a man of many companions may come to ruin, but there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother.
I love that so much because it kind of flips the script on,
Yeah,
how we normally think
totally.
about, the people closest to us.
Yeah, like we always think that, family and close friends are supposed to be the ones who are always there for us.
Right.
But, sometimes that's not the case.
Right. And this is saying that God is even closer to that.
Closer, yeah. And I think that's a really comforting thought.
It is
especially when we're feeling alone and like we don't have anyone to turn to.
Right. So this idea of God as a close friend
Mm-hmm.
really ties in nicely with those earlier themes that we're talking about, like God is a refuge
Right.
and God is a constant presence.
Exactly. And I think it's a really beautiful image to think of God as our friend.
It is. It really is. And then, the sermon also talks about how God's love isn't just a feeling,
Right.
but it's an action.
Yeah.
And it gives this powerful example from John.
You're talking about John 15:13-15.
That's it.
Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I no longer call you servants, for the servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends. For everything that I learned from my Father, I have made known to you.
Yeah, and it connects God's love to the ultimate act of sacrifice.
Totally.
Jesus laying down his life, for us.
That's right. And I think that's something that's really important to remember, is that God's love is not just a feeling, it's an action.
Right.
He demonstrated his love for us by sending his son to die for us.
Right. It's that tangible act, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's something that can really give us hope and encouragement.
Definitely. And it's interesting how it mentions this reciprocal nature of love, too, right? Jesus calls us his friends, but there's that element of obedience to his commands, too.
Right. And I think that's an important part of a relationship with God, is that it's not just about receiving his love. It's also about loving him in return.
Right. It's two-way.
It is. It's a two-way street. And I think that's what makes it so special.
Right. It's not passive.
It's not passive. Yeah. We have to actively participate in that relationship.
Yeah. And so that active participation, I think, is especially important when we're, going through those times that we feel deserted.
Absolutely. Because it's in those moments that we need to lean into our faith.
Right.
And to seek guidance from God and to strive to live in accordance with his teachings.
It's like the sermon is saying, don't just wallow.
Yeah. Don't just sit in your pain and isolation.
Yeah, like turn to God.
Turn to God, seek his will, and let your actions reflect his love.
And that call to action really ties in nicely with, everything else we've talked about, like prayer and waiting on God and doing good, even when we feel alone.
Right. It's all about finding strength and purpose in our relationship with God.
Even when things around us are falling apart.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important message for anyone who's struggling with the pain of feeling deserted.
Right.
It offers a pathway to healing and restoration.
And, it's a good reminder that even when things feel really, really dark, we are not alone.
We're not alone. God is with us, offering comfort and guidance and strength.
And the sermon, reiterates that in its closing.
Right. It brings us back to those themes of, God as our refuge.
Right.
His constant presence.
And that we're never alone.
We're never truly alone. And it actually uses Job 7:19 again.
Okay.
It says, will you never look away from me or let me alone even for an instant?
Yeah.
And I think that verse really captures God's, relentless love and care for us.
Right.
It's a declaration that no matter what we're going through,
Mm-hmm.
God is always there, watching over us, ready to help.
And to drive that home, it uses Jeremiah 15:27 again, too.
It does. I never sat in the company of revelers, never made merry with them. I sat alone because your hand was on me and you had filled me with indignation.
Like, even in those times of isolation,
Yeah.
there's a reason for it.
Right. There's a divine purpose.
Right. God's hand is on us, shaping us and leading us.
Better plan. Yeah.
And I think that's a really hopeful message to end on.
It is. It really is. And I think it's something that we all need to remember, especially when we're going through difficult times.
Right. That we are not alone.
We're not alone. God is with us.
He is always there.
He's always there. And he has a plan for our lives.
Right. Even if we can't see it at the moment.
Even if we can't see it. Yeah.
This has been a really, really cool look at, this part of the sermon.
It has.
We've got a lot to think about.
Yeah, we have a lot to think about.
About God's love.
Mm-hmm.
And, finding ways to cope when we're feeling deserted.
And I think it's important to reiterate that this message isn't just for Christians.
Right.
The themes of love, support, and finding strength in something greater than ourselves are universal.
Right. Everyone can relate to those things.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes this sermon so powerful, is that it speaks to the human experience in a way that transcends religious boundaries.
And speaking of, speaking to everyone,
Yeah.
there's this really thought-provoking question.
Oh, yeah.
That the sermon brings up.
At the end.
Right in its closing, it talks all about seeking God,
Mm-hmm.
when we're lonely.
Mm-hmm.
But then it asks how our understanding of his presence might change, when we're surrounded by people but still feel that isolation.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because it makes you think about those times when you're like in a crowd of people,
Right.
but you still feel completely alone.
Totally. And like, how does that internal experience,
Mm-hmm.
change how we see and relate to God?
Right, because if we're always, turning to God when we're physically alone,
Right.
how do we connect with him when we're feeling that loneliness in a crowd?
It's tricky, right?
Yeah, and how do we, deal with that feeling of abandonment
Right.
when we know that God is always supposed to be there.
It's almost like a paradox.
Yeah, it is like a paradox.
Feeling alone when you're not actually by yourself.
Exactly. And I think that that paradox really challenges us to look deeper at what loneliness is and how we experience God's presence.
Right.
You know, maybe it's not just about filling a void when we're missing human connection,
Right.
but it's about having this connection with God that can support us no matter what.
Right. Like whether we have people around us or not.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not just about where we seek God,
Mm-hmm.
but how we seek him.
I think that's a really good point. You know, it's not about finding the right place or the right time to connect with God.
Right.
It's about recognizing that he's present in every moment.
And maybe it's about being more intentional,
Yeah.
about acknowledging his presence in our everyday lives.
I think that's a really good point, because sometimes we can go through our days and we can be so focused on our own things
Right.
that we forget that God is there with us.
Right.
Walking alongside us every step of the way.
Yeah, so maybe it's about taking those moments throughout the day to
Mm.
just pause and acknowledge, that he's there.
And to thank him for his presence in our lives.
And to ask for his guidance and his strength.
Exactly.
Especially when we're feeling those moments of isolation.
Yeah, because he's always there for us,
Right.
whether we're aware of it or not.
This has been a really cool look at this sermon and this whole idea of feeling deserted and finding comfort.
It has been.
And I really hope that, those of you listening who have felt this way or are currently feeling this way, feel encouraged
Absolutely.
and empowered.
Yeah, there's always hope.
There's always hope. God is always there.
And he loves you.
That's right. And if you're interested in exploring these ideas further,
Yeah.
think about those times in your own life where you felt deserted or alone and how maybe your faith has shaped those experiences.
And what can you do to connect with God more?
You got it.
Not just when you're feeling down, but all the time.
Yeah, just make it a regular part of your life.
Exactly.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
Of course.
We'll see you next time.
IGFC.